"You don't deserve a single dollar of his money," Emily Carter's mother said flatly, sliding the court papers across the table only 3 days after the funeral. Emily stood very still as the words settled into the quiet living room, the same room where her grandfather Robert Carter used to sit every Sunday morning with a cup of weak coffee and the newspaper folded just right. He had been gone less than a week, yet the house already felt stripped of him, as if his absence had created a hollow space no one wanted to acknowledge. Emily was 26, small-framed, plainly dressed in black slacks and a sweater she'd worn since the service, and she looked nothing like the picture her parents were trying to paint. Mark and Linda Carter sat opposite her, composed and rehearsed, their grief neatly packed away, their focus sharpened into something harder. The lawsuit papers lay between them like a boundary line. Emily did not pick them up. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stared at her hands, remembering how those same hands had once helped her grandfather count out loose change at the kitchen table when she was 8 years old. How he'd smiled and told her patience mattered more than speed. Robert Carter had raised her in ways her parents never had time for. When Emily's parents worked late and traveled often, it was her grandfather who waited outside her school every afternoon, who drove exactly 25 miles per hour through their neighborhood because he said rules existed for a reason, who packed her lunches and left handwritten notes folded inside brown paper bags. To Emily, he had been stability, not wealth. The money had never crossed her mind until the lawyer called 2 days after the funeral and asked her to come in to discuss the will. She had assumed it was a formality, something procedural, something her parents would handle. Instead, she learned that Robert had left the majority of his estate to her, not out of impulse, but through careful planning done over nearly a decade. The house, the savings, even the modest investment account he'd built over years of careful living were all designated in her name. Emily had felt stunned, almost embarrassed by it, as if she'd been handed something she hadn't asked for. She had gone home that night intending to talk to her parents, believing the conversation would be awkward but civil. What she walked into instead was strategy. Mark spoke about fairness. Linda spoke about bloodlines. Neither spoke about Robert as a person. They spoke as if his life had been reduced to numbers on a page. Emily listened as they told her she had been manipulated, that she was too young to manage anything responsibly, that the will was questionable, and would be challenged. When she asked why they were doing this now, so soon after his death, Linda's expression hardened. Grief, she said, was not an excuse for bad decisions. That was the moment Emily understood something had shifted permanently. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a claim. Over the following days, calls went unanswered. Relatives stopped responding to messages. Whispers began circulating that Emily had turned against her own parents, that she had somehow pressured an old man into rewriting his will. At night, she replayed memories instead. The quiet ones that never made it into conversations about inheritance. Robert teaching her how to balance a checkbook. Robert insisting she learn how to cook simple meals because independence mattered. Robert telling her, not unkindly, that money revealed people long before it helped them. When the official court notice arrived, Emily read it once and placed it carefully back into the envelope. She did not hire a lawyer. She did not post explanations or defend herself. She went back to work, drove the same car she'd owned for years, and kept wearing the same black sweater. On the morning of the hearing, she walked into the courthouse alone, carrying nothing but a thin folder the estate attorney had given her. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Mark and Linda stood with their legal team, confident, polished, already discussing next steps. Emily took a seat on the bench across from them and waited. She thought of her grandfather's voice, steady and unhurried, telling her that character was something people recognized without being told. When the bailiff called the case and the doors opened, Emily rose, straightened her shoulders, and followed the others inside, unaware that this was the last moment anyone would ever see her as the weak one in the room. The days leading up to the hearing passed with an unnatural calm that unsettled Emily more than open hostility ever could. She returned to her small apartment, a modest one-bedroom 15 minutes from downtown, and resumed her routine as if nothing extraordinary was happening, waking at 6:30 each morning, making plain oatmeal, driving the same 12 miles to work, and answering emails with the same steady tone. At night, however, silence pressed in. She sorted through a single cardboard box the estate attorney had sent home with her. Not filled with valuables, but with personal items her grandfather had labeled for her years ago. Inside were old photographs, carefully dated on the back in neat handwriting, receipts folded into precise squares, and a leather-bound notebook worn thin at the corners. Emily recognized it immediately. Robert had carried it everywhere. He used it to record expenses, reminders, and thoughts he never spoke aloud. She sat on the edge of her bed and turned each page slowly, noticing how methodical he had been. Every dollar accounted for. Every decision explained. It became clear that nothing about the will had been rushed or accidental. Robert had anticipated resistance, maybe even betrayal, and had prepared for it quietly, the way he did everything else. Emily closed the notebook and set it beside her, feeling an unfamiliar mix of reassurance and sadness. The man who had taught her patience had also known exactly who would challenge his choices. The following morning, she visited the modest house Robert had lived in for over 40 years. It stood on a quiet street lined with maples, the kind of neighborhood where nothing looked impressive but everything felt permanent. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the porch swept clean, just as he had always kept it. Emily unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing in the faint scent of old books and lemon cleaner. She walked from room to room without touching anything, remembering how each space had been used. The kitchen where he taught her to measure ingredients by sight. The living room where he listened more than he spoke. The spare bedroom where she had slept countless nights when her parents were away. It struck her then that her parents had not set foot in this house since the funeral. They had not asked about its contents or its condition. They had only asked about the value. That realization stayed with her as the hearing approached. On the morning of the court date, Emily dressed simply, choosing clothes she already owned rather than buying anything new. She did not want to look strategic. She wanted to look honest. As she drove to the courthouse, traffic moved steadily, the radio playing softly in the background, life continuing as if her family was not unraveling inside a legal file. She arrived early and sat in the hallway, watching strangers pass, each carrying their own private disputes. When Mark and Linda arrived with their attorneys, they did not acknowledge her. They spoke in hushed voices, confident and rehearsed, as if the outcome had already been decided. Emily remained seated, hands folded in her lap, her grandfather's notebook tucked carefully into her bag. When the courtroom doors opened and everyone took their places, the atmosphere shifted. Judge William Hawkins entered with a calm authority that quieted the room without effort. He listened without interruption as Mark and Linda's attorney laid out their argument, citing concern, influence, and supposed vulnerability. Emily watched her parents as they spoke, noticing how composed they looked, how practiced their expressions were. When it was her turn, Emily stood as instructed. She answered questions clearly without embellishment. She did not accuse or defend. She simply explained her relationship with her grandfather as it had been, consistent, present, and rooted in everyday care rather than expectation. She spoke about routines, responsibilities, and conversations that had spanned years, not months. The judge asked a few precise questions, his gaze steady. Emily handed over the notebook at the request of the estate attorney, and Judge Hawkins examined it carefully, turning pages in silence. The room felt suspended in time. No one spoke. No one interrupted. As the judge read, something subtle changed. His posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. He looked up once at Emily, then again at her parents. There was no judgment in his expression, only recognition. When he spoke, his voice was even, measured and final. He referenced preparation, intent, and consistency, words that carried weight without needing emphasis. Emily listened, her heart steady, as the narrative that had been constructed around her quietly dissolved. By the time the judge finished, the outcome was clear. The challenge was dismissed. Costs were assigned. The will stood as written. Emily remained standing until instructed to sit, her hands still folded, her face composed. She did not look at her parents. She did not need to. As the courtroom began to empty, Judge Hawkins addressed her once more, briefly, formally, acknowledging the thoroughness of the estate planning and the clarity of Robert Carter's intentions. Emily nodded, thanked him, and gathered her belongings. When she stepped back into the hallway, the noise of everyday life returned, footsteps, murmured conversations, doors opening and closing. She walked past her parents without a word, feeling not victorious but settled. Her grandfather had trusted her for a reason, and for the first time since his death, she understood that his final gift had never been the inheritance itself, but the certainty that truth, when prepared properly, did not need to raise its voice to be heard. In the weeks after the hearing, Emily's life did not suddenly improve in any visible way, but it became unmistakably clearer. The courthouse decision settled the legal question, yet it quietly rearranged the relationships around her. Word traveled quickly through extended family circles, not through official statements, but through pauses, changed tones, and unanswered calls. Some relatives reached out with brief messages that sounded supportive without admitting fault. Others stayed silent entirely. Emily did not chase explanations. She returned to her routine, understanding now that distance could be a form of honesty. The house on Maple Street became her responsibility sooner than expected. She spent her Saturdays there, sorting through decades of carefully kept belongings, donating what had purpose elsewhere and keeping what carried memory rather than value. She learned that her grandfather had labeled everything not for control, but to prevent conflict. Envelopes were marked with dates and reasons. Tools were organized by use, not worth. Even his closet reflected restraint. Emily moved slowly, respecting the order he had maintained. One afternoon, she found a small envelope tucked behind a row of books in the living room cabinet. Inside was a letter addressed to her in the same steady handwriting she knew well. It did not mention the court or the lawsuit. It spoke instead about choice, about how people reveal themselves when they believe no one is watching. He wrote that he had never worried about Emily's ability to handle money, only about how others would react when she did. Reading it, she understood that the inheritance had never been a reward. It had been a final lesson. Outside the house, her parents began to experience consequences they had not anticipated. The lawsuit had become a matter of public record, and, in a town that valued reputation as much as privacy, questions arose. Friends grew cautious. Conversations shortened. Invitations stopped arriving. Mark and Linda had won nothing and lost control of the narrative they believed they owned. Emily did not witness this directly, but she heard fragments through distant relatives and neighbors who still spoke to her grandfather's memory with respect. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt resolution. At work, Emily noticed subtle changes as well. She spoke with more certainty, made decisions without second-guessing herself, and declined projects that conflicted with her values. The experience had stripped away the need to justify her boundaries. When colleagues asked about the court case, she kept her responses factual and brief. She had learned that oversharing invited interpretation, and interpretation often favored the loudest voice, not the most accurate one. On a quiet Sunday morning, she returned to the cemetery with a small bouquet of daisies, flowers her grandfather preferred because they were simple and resilient. She stood by the headstone and spoke aloud for the first time since the funeral, telling him the house was safe, the records intact, and the noise finally gone. She thanked him, not for what he had left her, but for trusting her to carry it without becoming hardened by it. As she walked back to her car, she noticed how light the air felt, how uncomplicated the moment was. The inheritance had not changed her circumstances overnight, but it had changed her understanding of loyalty and preparation. She knew now that love was not measured by proximity or titles, but by consistency and foresight. In the distance, life continued at its usual pace, cars passing, neighbors tending lawns, ordinary routines unfolding. Emily drove home, the thin folder from the estate attorney resting on the passenger seat, unopened since the hearing. She did not rush to plan or spend. There was time for that. What mattered was that the truth had been documented, protected, and spoken when necessary. Her grandfather had anticipated the storm and anchored her before it arrived. And as Emily turned onto her street, she realized that the quiet he had valued so deeply was no longer something she had to defend. It had been secured long before she ever needed it. The months that followed settled into a pattern Emily had not expected, one defined less by change and more by quiet confirmation of who remained and who did not. She continued spending weekends at the Maple Street house, not out of obligation, but because it felt right to keep the place alive in small ways, opening windows, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, replacing a burned-out porch light exactly as her grandfather would have done. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering casual updates and stories about Robert that had nothing to do with money, how he once helped jump a car in the snow, how he always returned borrowed tools cleaner than when he took them. Emily listened and thanked them, sensing that these conversations mattered more than any formal inheritance process. Meanwhile, her parents' distance hardened into something permanent. There were no apologies, no attempts to explain their actions, only a brief message from Linda asking when the house would be listed for sale. Emily read it once and did not respond. The property was not listed. It was not discussed. That silence, she learned, spoke more clearly than argument ever could. As winter approached, Emily made a careful review of her finances, not because she felt newly wealthy, but because responsibility now carried a different weight. She met with the estate attorney again, asked measured questions, and took notes, following the same deliberate approach her grandfather had modeled. She declined suggestions to make aggressive investments or dramatic lifestyle changes. Stability, she understood, was not something to prove. During one visit, the attorney mentioned that Mark and Linda had inquired again about appealing the decision. The effort had gone nowhere. The documentation was too thorough. Emily thanked him for the update without reaction. The matter no longer occupied space in her thoughts. At work, she was offered a promotion that required relocating to another state. It was a good opportunity, but it would pull her away from the house and the routine she had just begun to establish. Emily requested time to consider, then declined. For the first time, her decision was not driven by fear of disappointing others, but by clarity about what she wanted to protect. The house was not a burden. It was a reference point. On a cold afternoon in early December, Emily found herself sorting through a final drawer in her grandfather's desk. Inside was a single photograph of the two of them standing in front of the house years earlier, her arm linked through his, both squinting in the sun. On the back, he had written the date and a simple note: "Consistency matters." She placed the photo on the mantel, not prominently, but where it could be seen without drawing attention. As the holidays approached, invitations from extended family arrived, some cautious, some overly cheerful. Emily declined most of them. She spent Thanksgiving alone by choice, cooking a modest meal and setting an extra place at the table out of habit, not sadness. On Christmas morning, she walked through the neighborhood, watching lights flicker on in windows, feeling a calm she had not known before. The inheritance had not brought her closer to people who mattered. It had revealed who never had. In a small but telling development, the local paper ran a brief notice about a community donation made in Robert Carter's name to the public library. Emily had arranged it quietly, funding a reading program for children, something her grandfather had supported for years. Her parents were not informed in advance. When they learned of it through the article, they did not reach out. Emily did not wonder why. By the time spring returned, the Maple Street house felt less like an inherited asset and more like an extension of her own values. She had repainted one room, replaced worn curtains, and planted herbs in the backyard garden, careful not to erase what had been there before. Standing on the porch one evening, she realized that the conflict which once threatened to define her had instead clarified her boundaries. The court case was over, but its impact remained in subtler ways. Emily no longer felt the need to defend her choices or explain her past. She had learned that preparation, patience, and restraint were not passive qualities. They were forms of strength that did not announce themselves. As the sun set behind the trees, Emily turned off the porch light and went inside, closing the door gently, exactly as her grandfather had always done, leaving behind a chapter of her life that no longer needed to be revisited. By early summer, the final administrative steps of the estate were completed, and Emily found herself in a phase that felt unfamiliar, one where decisions were no longer reactions but choices. She began spending more time at the Maple Street house during the evenings, not to manage paperwork, but to sit quietly and read, the way her grandfather once did after dinner. The house had settled into a rhythm again, its creaks and hums no longer sounding empty. One evening, while reviewing a stack of old utility bills she planned to file away, Emily noticed a pattern in the handwritten notes Robert had added over the years, small reminders to himself about conserving energy, tracking expenses, and planning months ahead. It reinforced something she had been thinking about for a while, that the inheritance was not meant to elevate her lifestyle, but to stabilize it. Acting on that understanding, Emily met with a financial planner recommended by the estate attorney, someone known for conservative strategies rather than aggressive growth. The meeting was straightforward, focused on sustainability, emergency reserves, and long-term planning. There were no dramatic projections, no promises of rapid wealth. Emily appreciated that. It aligned with everything her grandfather had believed. Meanwhile, her parents' attempts to reinsert themselves into her life became sporadic and indirect. A distant cousin mentioned that Linda had asked whether Emily planned to sell the house after all. Another relative hinted that Mark felt misunderstood and wanted to clear the air. Emily listened without engaging, understanding that clarity was not something they were seeking. They were seeking access. She declined to reopen conversations that had already revealed their purpose. As the anniversary of her grandfather's passing approached, Emily organized a small gathering at the house, inviting only those who had been present in Robert's life without expectation. A few neighbors, a former co-worker of his, and the librarian who had known him for years came by. There was no formal program, no speeches. People shared stories naturally, laughed softly, and remembered him as he had been, practical, kind, and quietly observant. Emily watched from the kitchen doorway, realizing that this was the community he had chosen, one built on mutual respect rather than obligation. After everyone left, she cleaned up alone, feeling a sense of completeness she had not anticipated. The next day, she received an email from her parents' attorney requesting a conversation about family reconciliation. Emily read it carefully and then archived it without response. The legal matter was resolved. There was nothing left to negotiate. At work, Emily was asked to mentor a new hire, someone younger who reminded her of herself years earlier, uncertain but capable. She found satisfaction in guiding without controlling, offering structure without expectation. It occurred to her that her grandfather had done the same for her, preparing her quietly for moments she never knew would come. In late August, Emily finalized plans to establish a small educational fund in Robert's name, supporting practical financial literacy courses at the local community center. It was modest, sustainable, and aligned with his values. The paperwork was simple, the intent clear. When the confirmation letter arrived, Emily placed it in the same folder that held the will documents, completing a cycle rather than beginning a new one. As summer faded into fall, Emily stood in the backyard garden, harvesting herbs she had planted months earlier, their growth steady and unremarkable, yet deeply satisfying. She understood now that the conflict surrounding the inheritance had never been about money. It had been about control, perception, and the discomfort people feel when they cannot rewrite a narrative to suit themselves. Her grandfather had anticipated that, and had left her something more durable than assets. He had left her proof that preparation outlasts confrontation, that restraint carries authority, and that integrity does not require validation. Emily brought the basket inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and turned off the light, moving through the house with ease. The noise that once surrounded her had faded completely, replaced by a certainty that did not need to announce itself. What remained was not victory, but alignment, a life adjusted carefully back into its proper place. Autumn brought a quieter season, one that revealed consequences without confrontation, and Emily noticed how the absence of drama made truths easier to see. The Maple Street house no longer felt like a responsibility she managed, but a place that responded to care in predictable ways. Repairs held. Bills stayed manageable. Decisions felt proportionate. She maintained her routines, working during the week, tending the house on weekends, and meeting occasionally with the financial planner to review steady progress rather than chase growth. It was during one of these meetings that Emily learned something unexpected. The planner mentioned that a lien request related to her parents had been denied months earlier, an attempt to flag the property that never met legal standards. It had gone nowhere, quietly dismissed. Emily thanked him for the information and asked no follow-up questions. The attempt, like the lawsuit, had failed without her intervention. She understood then that some efforts collapsed simply because they were unsupported by truth. As the months passed, Emily's parents' world narrowed in ways they had not predicted. Their social circle shifted, invitations thinning, conversations ending sooner than they once did. A former family friend reached out to Emily to apologize for having believed rumors early on. Emily accepted the apology politely and moved on. She had learned that forgiveness did not require reintegration. Meanwhile, the educational fund Emily had established began its first cycle. She attended an opening session at the community center, sitting in the back of the room as adults listened attentively to lessons on budgeting, credit, and long-term planning. No one there knew her connection to the fund. She preferred it that way. Watching people take notes and ask thoughtful questions felt like honoring her grandfather in the most practical sense. Afterward, the program coordinator thanked her briefly, remarking on the quiet generosity behind the support. Emily smiled and left without explanation. At work, her mentorship role expanded, and she found herself trusted with decisions that once would have required approval. She spoke carefully, acted deliberately, and earned confidence without asking for it. It occurred to her that the trial had not hardened her, but refined her sense of proportion. She no longer confused urgency with importance. Late one afternoon, as she sorted mail at the house, Emily received a handwritten letter forwarded from her parents' address. Inside was a short note from Linda, composed and restrained, suggesting a meeting to discuss moving forward as a family. There was no acknowledgement of the lawsuit, no admission of harm, only a request framed as reasonableness. Emily read the note once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer with other documents that required no action. She did not feel anger. She felt clarity. Moving forward did not mean revisiting what had already been decided. As winter approached again, Emily prepared the house for colder weather, sealing windows, servicing the furnace, and stacking firewood along the side of the garage. Each task was completed methodically without rush. She remembered her grandfather's insistence that preparation removed fear from uncertainty. One evening, while reviewing old correspondence to archive properly, she discovered copies of letters Robert had sent to attorneys years before, asking precise questions about estate challenges and documenting his intent in clear language. The dates confirmed what Emily already knew. He had anticipated resistance long before illness or age made his choices urgent. He had protected her not by secrecy, but by diligence. Standing in the study, Emily felt a quiet gratitude that settled deeper than relief. The months that followed passed without incident. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public reversals, no apologies that demanded response. What remained was stability built on forethought. Emily hosted a modest dinner for a few neighbors in early spring. The table set simply, the conversation easy. No one asked about money. No one needed to. As the evening ended and the house returned to stillness, Emily reflected on how little noise was required to maintain what mattered. The inheritance had drawn a line, not between wealth and want, but between intention and impulse. Her parents had crossed it without preparation and found no footing. Her grandfather had reinforced it quietly and left her standing on solid ground. Emily turned off the lights, locked the door, and went upstairs, carrying with her the understanding that outcomes are shaped long before they are revealed, and that when preparation meets pressure, it does not need to explain itself. By the time summer returned again, Emily understood that stability had a way of attracting attention without seeking it. The Maple Street house had become known quietly in the neighborhood as a place that was cared for, not displayed, and people treated it accordingly. One afternoon, while Emily was repainting a window frame, a familiar car slowed near the curb. She did not look up immediately, but she recognized it before it stopped. Mark stepped out first, older than she remembered, his confidence dulled at the edges. Linda followed, her posture controlled, her expression practiced. They stood at the end of the driveway for a moment, uncertain. Emily set down her brush, wiped her hands on a cloth, and waited without invitation. Mark spoke first, explaining that they were in the area and thought it might be time to talk. There was no apology in his tone, only a suggestion that time itself should have softened what had happened. Emily listened without interrupting. When Linda added that families made mistakes and needed to move on, Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its premise. She responded calmly, telling them that the legal matters were resolved, and that her life had settled into a direction she intended to keep. She did not accuse. She did not remind them of courtrooms or documents. She simply stated that reopening the past would not change its outcome. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, Mark looked at the house as if seeing it for the first time, realizing perhaps that it was no longer accessible to him. Linda adjusted her purse strap and said they hoped Emily would reconsider someday. Emily wished them well and returned to her work. They drove away without further words. That evening, Emily sat at the kitchen table and reflected on the encounter. Not with anger, but with understanding. The visit had not been about reconciliation. It had been about testing whether boundaries still held. They did. In the weeks that followed, Emily noticed subtle shifts elsewhere. Her parents' names appeared less frequently in community discussions. A local committee Mark once chaired quietly selected a new lead. Linda's social calendar thinned. These were not punishments imposed by Emily or the court. They were the natural consequences of choices that revealed priorities. Emily continued with her own plans. She expanded the educational fund slightly, adding a workshop for young adults entering the workforce, focused on practical decision-making rather than aspiration. She attended the first session briefly, listening from the back, recognizing the same nervous focus she once carried. It confirmed that the path she was on aligned with something larger than personal closure. One afternoon, the estate attorney called to inform her that all remaining records had been archived and the case officially closed. Emily thanked him and filed the notice away without ceremony. That chapter no longer required attention. Later that week, she received a short message from a cousin who had once repeated rumors without question. The message was cautious, acknowledging misunderstanding and expressing hope for renewed connection. Emily replied politely, keeping the exchange brief. She understood now that proximity did not equal trust, and history did not guarantee loyalty. As the season progressed, Emily hosted a small dinner at the house, inviting a handful of people who had been consistently present. The evening was unremarkable in the best way. Conversation flowed easily. Laughter filled the rooms without effort. No one spoke about the past. No one needed to. After the last guest left and the dishes were done, Emily stepped onto the porch and looked out at the quiet street. She thought of her grandfather, of how he had prepared for moments like these by anticipating not events, but behavior. He had known who would stand quietly and who would demand loudly. He had chosen accordingly. Emily realized then that the most decisive moment had not been the judge's ruling or her parents' departure. It had been her own decision to remain composed when provoked, to let preparation speak instead of emotion. That choice had set everything else in motion. She turned off the porch light and went inside, closing the door with the same gentle finality her grandfather always used. The noise that once threatened her life had not been defeated through confrontation, but through consistency. And in that consistency, Emily found a strength that required no witnesses, no validation, and no return visits from the past. As the year drew toward its end, Emily noticed that the calm she had built was no longer something she actively maintained, but something that carried itself forward. The Maple Street house required less attention now, not because she neglected it, but because consistent care had reduced the need for constant adjustment. Repairs held. Systems worked. Bills arrived and were paid without stress. The predictability of it all felt earned. Emily's life outside the house reflected the same balance. At work, she was asked to lead a small team on a long-term project, one that required patience more than urgency. She accepted, recognizing that the trust placed in her mirrored the way her grandfather had always trusted her, without theatrics or pressure. In quiet moments, she reflected on how differently things might have unfolded if she had reacted instead of prepared, if she had argued instead of documented, if she had sought approval instead of clarity. The contrast was instructive. Late one afternoon, Emily received an unexpected call from the estate attorney. There was nothing urgent, he explained, only a final courtesy notice that all archived records related to Robert Carter's estate would be transferred to long-term storage, and no further correspondence was anticipated. The matter, in every official sense, was complete. Emily thanked him and ended the call, feeling a sense of closure that was neither dramatic nor emotional. It was simply finished. Around the same time, she learned through indirect channels that her parents had sold their home and relocated to a smaller property in another town. No announcement was made. No explanation followed. It was a quiet exit that matched the way their influence had gradually faded. Emily did not comment on it. She understood now that not every ending required acknowledgement. As winter settled in, Emily hosted another modest gathering at the house, this time to mark the end of the year. There were no speeches, no formalities, Just shared food and easy conversation. Someone mentioned Robert in passing, recalling a small kindness he had once offered without expecting recognition. Emily smiled, listening, realizing that this was how legacies actually survived, not through assets or arguments, but through remembered behavior. After the guests left, she stood alone in the living room, looking at the photograph on the mantel, the one labeled years ago with a simple reminder about consistency. It struck her that the judge's role in her story had been important, but limited. He had recognized preparation when he saw it, but the outcome had been decided long before the courtroom doors ever opened. The real turning point had been her grandfather's foresight, and her willingness to respect it without altering it for convenience. In the following weeks, Emily finalized plans to ensure the educational fund would continue beyond her direct involvement, setting clear guidelines and documentation so it could operate independently. She insisted on transparency and sustainability, principles that mirrored everything she had learned. When the paperwork was complete, she filed it carefully, not with a sense of triumph but with relief. There would be no confusion later. No room for dispute. As the year ended, Emily took a final walk through the house one evening, checking doors, turning off lights, moving through each room with familiarity. She felt no urge to change anything. The space reflected her values now as clearly as it once reflected her grandfather's. The conflict that had once threatened to overwhelm her had resolved into something smaller and more manageable. A lesson rather than a wound. Emily understood that what had protected her was not stubbornness or luck, but alignment between intention and action. Her parents had acted from impulse and expectation. Her grandfather had acted from preparation and restraint. The difference had shaped everything. As she went upstairs and closed the door for the night, Emily felt certain that nothing more needed to be proven. The story had already reached its natural conclusion, one built quietly, deliberately, and without the need for revision. By the time another spring arrived, Emily no longer measured her life against what had been taken or defended, but against what had been preserved. The Maple Street house stood as quietly as it always had, its presence steady rather than symbolic, and Emily moved through it with the ease of someone who belonged without needing permission. She had settled fully into a life shaped by intention, where decisions were made early and followed through without spectacle. The educational fund continued operating smoothly, its guidelines respected, its purpose clear. Reports arrived quarterly, each confirming that the structure her grandfather valued was holding. Emily reviewed them carefully, filed them properly, and moved on, satisfied that systems once built correctly required only respect to endure. At work, her team completed the long-term project successfully, not through bursts of effort, but through consistency and accountability. When praised for the outcome, Emily redirected credit calmly, acknowledging process rather than personality. She had learned that attention was not the same as impact. Occasionally, news of her parents surfaced indirectly, a mention that they had settled into their new town, that they kept mostly to themselves. There were no further attempts at contact. Emily did not interpret the silence as growth or regret. She accepted it as alignment. The distance between them no longer felt like loss. It felt like definition. One afternoon, Emily visited the cemetery again, standing before her grandfather's headstone as she had many times before. She did not bring flowers this time. She stood quietly, hands folded, and reflected on how much had changed without appearing to. She understood now that the trial had not been the conflict of her life, but the confirmation of its direction. Robert Carter had not left her a fortune in the way people often imagined. He had left her a structure, a framework that revealed truth when pressure was applied. The judge had seen it immediately, not because of emotion, but because preparation is unmistakable to those trained to recognize it. Emily thought about that moment often, not as a victory, but as proof that clarity outlasts confrontation. As she drove away, she noticed how the road ahead looked no different than it ever had. Yet she felt entirely certain about where she was going. In the months that followed, Emily made modest plans for the future, renovations that improved safety, rather than appearance, investments that favored stability over return, commitments that aligned with her capacity rather than her ego. She did not feel compelled to tell her story. Those who needed to understand it already did. Those who did not would never require explanation. One evening as she sat in the living room reading, the same soft lamp glowing that her grandfather once preferred. Emily realized that the noise which once threatened to overwhelm her had dissolved completely. There were no lingering disputes, no unfinished conversations demanding resolution. The past had been documented, respected, and released. What remained was not triumph but coherence. Her life made sense to her, and that was enough. As the night deepened, Emily closed the book, turned off the light, and went upstairs, the house settling around her in familiar silence. She understood then that the inheritance had fulfilled its purpose. It had protected what mattered, revealed what did not, and allowed her to move forward without distortion. And in that understanding, Emily found a quiet confidence that required no witness, no defense, and no return to the courtroom where it had once been confirmed. The judge had recognized the truth in a single look, but Emily carried it with her every day, living proof that preparation, integrity, and restraint speak louder than accusation ever could.